Hello and welcome back. Thanks for joining. My name is Berit and today I want to talk about some thoughts and feelings that I have about The Vegetarian by Han Kang. First, some stuff about the book. This is a South Korean novel originally published in 2007 and then translated into English in 2015. And this book also won the International Man Booker Prize in 2016. And I have gathered that this book is quite popular and quite known, so chances are you might have heard of it, you might have read it, in which case please let me know what you think, because I would like to hear other opinions about this book. And this book has also been translated into Norwegian in 2018. Why do I tell you this? Because I read it in Norwegian, because my local library didn't have it in English. This book tells the story of a woman named Young-hye, if that's how you pronounce her name. And she decides one day, or rather one night, that she doesn't want to eat meat anymore. The novel goes on to tell you about the consequences and the conflicts that this decision brings with it. Apparently it's quite unusual in South Korea to not eat meat, which was something that I didn't know going into the novel. Yeah, and as it turns out, Young-hye's decision sets off quite an avalanche of conflicts and consequences that mostly have to do with her role, or the role of a woman in a patriarchal society. So this book isn't so much about her not eating meat, it's more about the underlying social conflicts that this decision kind of opens up and addresses. The Vegetarian is told in 3 parts, and we always have a third-person narrator, but in every part this narrator focuses on a different person who is in some way related to Young-hye. So the first part focuses on her husband, the second part on her brother-in-law, and the third part on her big sister. And over the course of the story we don't really get much insight into Young-hye, which is really interesting because that makes her a very enigmatic and very distant protagonist. And that was one of the things that I found very, very interesting. I will try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. Like, if you don't want to have any spoilers for what's going to happen in the story, then don't watch this video, but go and read the book. But I will try to avoid like major spoilers. But I also hope that my blabbering won't be too unorganized and confusing by me trying to avoid spoiling anything. So, I guess the overall feeling that I have, or the thought that sticks with me after that I've read the book now, is how it discusses social structures and especially women's roles in a society driven by men. Like, the 2 men that the book focuses on, the husband and the brother-in-law, I wasn't a fan of them. Both were very egoistic in different ways, but also in similar ways, kind of. And the husband really irritated me, and that like right from the start. There are so many situations where it's just obvious that he's egoistic. Like, for example, when Young-hye decides that she doesn't want to eat meat anymore, he's kind of mad about that, but only because he doesn't get to eat meat at home anymore because she won't cook meat for him. And although we do get some insight into Young-hye in the first part, because we get some descriptions of her nightmares, which are the reason why she says she doesn't want to eat meat anymore, and her nightmares are kind of graphic. Her husband doesn't really want to understand her. He does ask, why do you not want to eat meat anymore? And she says, because I had a dream. But he doesn't really investigate any further. He doesn't try to understand, okay, what's going on with my wife? What's the problem? But he's all the time very focused on what he looks like in front of, for example, his boss at a job dinner, where it's a big issue that Young-hye doesn't want to eat the meat that they serve. And he's very concerned about how her behavior might influence how other people perceive him, but he doesn't really care about her problem, which was really irritating. That was kind of the main thing in the first part, and I realized quickly that I wasn't quite braced for what was about to come, because the end of the first part escalates brutally in a way. I won't say what happens, but I hadn't expected that. If you've read the book, you know what I mean. I hadn't expected that. I had expected something like that for the end of the book and not for like page 60. So that was quite interesting how the situation spiraled out of control pretty early on, because the decision that someone doesn't want to eat meat anymore in itself is quite like peaceful. But in this book here, it's a big issue, and yeah, things get out of hand quite quickly already in the first part, focused on a not so very nice husband. So the second part then is narrated by Young-hye's brother-in-law, and I'm not a fan of him either, because he sexualizes and objectifies Young-hye in, surprise, a very egoistic way. His sexual obsession is based on something very superficial. It's based on a pigmented mole that Young-hye has, which is called a Mongolian spot. A Mongolian spot is a pigmented mole, like bluish, that a lot of Asian kids apparently have, and it's usually located circa at the tailbone, but it goes away latest when you're in puberty, I think. But for some reason, Young-hye's brother-in-law has gotten to know that she apparently still has this Mongolian spot, and at some point he even sees it, and that makes all of his fantasizing about his sister-in-law go out of hand. And even though he kind of realizes that it's his sister-in-law we're talking about, it's still not big enough of an issue for him to maybe not fantasize about her while masturbating and stuff like that. So he gets past this problem quite quickly. The brother-in-law obviously also doesn't want to try and understand his sister-in-law, because some time has passed between part 1 and part 2. So there are some questions that he might want to have answered by her about her situation. She has become kind of weirder, and he paints Young-hye with flowers at some point. That's like the main plot of part 2, that he wants her to be part of his artwork, in which he wants to paint flowers on her to really emphasize this Mongolian spot on her body, and she agrees to that, and we get to experience that Young-hye seems to be much more comfortable with the flowers on her body than she is, for example, when she has clothes on. Her brother-in-law also notices that, but is he interested in finding out why that might be the case or what might be the issue? No. He's not really trying to understand her either. I won't say any more about this part because everything beyond this would be a spoiler. But yeah, it's clear for the most part here that Young-hye kind of drifts away mentally. We as readers don't really get to get a grip on her. We don't really get to understand her anymore because the person that this part focuses on doesn't try to understand her. So it's really interesting to get this outside perspective of her. It's also irritating that you kind of want to know more, but since the person that we focus on in this part doesn't try to understand her, you basically have no chance of understanding her either. Things escalate, and let's just say that in part 3, which again takes place a little later, our protagonist is in a psychiatric hospital in like the closed section. This third part is the part that focuses on her big sister, and that is the part that kind of mostly sticks with me because we now get a more reflective perspective on what has happened and on the situation. And the situation in the third part is that, as I said, Young-hye is in a psychiatric hospital and her sister visits her. And Young-hye is treated for schizophrenia and anorexia. Young-hye's sister sits at her bedside and tries to convince her to eat again because she has gotten down to like a very critical weight. We have several flashbacks in that part from the sister about earlier situations, about the relationship between the sisters, about the marriage. For the most part, also here it's very clear that Young-hye has gone to a absolutely different place mentally. She's very distant, apathetic, she's just lying on the bed. While Young-hye's sister is kind of going from being desperate because she doesn't know how to convince Young-hye to eat and to not let herself basically die by refusing to eat. She goes from that desperation, which makes her mad, to kind of moments of maybe understanding her sister, or maybe at least having the chance to understand her, which is quite interesting because in this third part we also get to know a lot about how both Young-hye and her sister have kind of suffered because they are women in a society driven by men. And her sister, she has always tried to please everyone, to be like the good and the responsible person. But yeah, the reward that the sister got for taking care of her father, her husband, her son is quite bleak. And what was pretty interesting is that there is like a parallel between Young-hye and her sister, in that for both women, their defiance of the social expectations is connected to their bodies. There is also a parallel, like when Young-hye first decides that she doesn't want to eat meat anymore, she has these dreams. And these dreams lead to her suffering from sleeplessness. And that just kind of gets worse and worse because she thinks that when she stops eating meat, the dreams will go away again, but they don't. And her sister also has this problem. She cannot sleep anymore, she cannot rest. And I thought that this was pretty interesting because it made me think about whether there's a parallel between the two women and how they don't fit into what society expects from them, and how they kind of silently defy those expectations and therewith the social rules. So that was my messy thoughts about what happens in this book. It took me quite some time to read this novel. I think I needed 5 weeks, although this is only like 200 pages long, at least in the Norwegian version. And that was partly because I didn't feel like reading a lot in May, so I didn't. And also because I read it in Norwegian, which just slows down my reading process because I need more brain cells to understand what's in the text, what's happening, and partly because the book made me feel uncomfortable, so I took a break from it in between. And the reason why the book made me feel uncomfortable is mainly because of the two men, because they are using the protagonist in very uncool ways to satisfy themselves or the picture that they have of themselves or of Young-hye. And also the book escalates in ways that I didn't quite expect. I mean, I didn't really know what I was expecting going into it, but it was uncomfortable to read at some points. And everything is also written in a very unagitated, distanced way, which also makes the things that happen, or at least some of the things that happen, stand out as more extreme, or just they hit you a bit more because they are narrated in a very unagitated way. That also emphasized for me how realistic some of the aspects, or most of the aspects of what is narrated here are. And that made me really uncomfortable because a lot of what I found to be very realistic was related to some kind of abuse of Young-hye, social, sexual, whatever. But also the way in which the book made me feel uncomfortable was kind of a sign for how good the writing was, because it made me feel uncomfortable because it was written so well. So overall, yeah, the book was quite different from what I expected, but again, I didn't know what I expected going into this. I wasn't really braced for the abyss that was lying underneath the story, but it was a very good read. It was very impressive. And I also have the feeling that I want to read more South Korean literature. The book also made me wonder whether South Korean fiction, maybe in particular, tends to escalate in ways that we as Westerners, or I as a Western European potato, might not be used to, or whether the very few examples of South Korean fiction that I know just almost all happen to be in that category. Like, this was the first novel from a South Korean author that I've read, I think. And apart from that, I know one Korean manhwa, and I have watched one Korean TV series. Both of those were Kingdom, so we're talking Korean zombies. And then I know literally like 4 films: Old Boy, Parasite, The Handmaiden, which all escalate, you could say. And then I also know Train to Busan, which again is Korean zombies. So, you know, I don't exactly have a broad knowledge of South Korean fiction, which I think I want to change, because, as I said, I found this book pretty impressive. So I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts and rambling about The Vegetarian. As I said, if you've read the book, please let me know what you think. I would be very interested in hearing more opinions about this book. As you can tell, I don't have the most organized thoughts about it, but yeah. We'll see what I read next, and maybe I'll see you in the next video. Bye!